Hi everyone, my name is Joyce Bock from Salubrious Events, and we specialise in subjects which are on the outer edge but are emerging in our society and which are good for us. And I do think that investigating and looking and researching the paranormal and UFOs are good for us, because it's a big part of our lives that's kind of just being pushed in the background for some people, but not for Ben, who is with me here today, Ben Hurle, who has been investigating UFOs for how many years now?
About 10 years.
10 years, wow.
About 10 years.
10 years, that's, yeah, a long time. And in particular, he has looked at cases in Victoria, which is a state in Australia. So Melbourne is the capital city. So Ben has been, looking at a lot of cases in Victoria. And he is also the president of the Victoria UFO Action Group, which has been functioning for 10 years?
10 or 11 years, yes.
10 or 11 years.
Same time frame.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I wasn't involved from the very get-go, but certainly, after the first 12 months or so, I came on board, yeah.
Okay, yep. So,
started by Andrew Arnold, of course.
That's right, yeah. Andrew Arnold, who started that group, and it's just grown. And the group has had many events. It's investigated a lot of cases, and has had a lot of activity in giving talks to the public and about the UFOs, aerial phenomena, and unidentified aerial phenomena. So, yeah, Victoria has had quite a lot of famous cases, being such a small state. Did you want to maybe summarise, if you can, all the famous cases, the main ones to start with?
Yeah, I sure can. You're right. Victoria has had a very long, rich UFO history. It goes back many, many, many years. In fact, it goes back to Aboriginal times. The phenomenon has been with us since humanity has been around, basically. So it's no surprise that Victoria has had a lot of UFO interaction over many, many years, and we can certainly say, since settlement, there has been a lot of cases. And but in terms of being investigated, it's probably been investigated since the 1950s, and that's kind of really where the UFO record starts, is around about the 1950s, when Viewforce was the original UFO investigation group. So, but every area of the state has actually got a very rich UFO history. So people say to me, "Where do UFOs appear?" And I say, "Well, they actually have appeared everywhere." And that may sound like a big statement, but when you spend as much time as I have looking at UFO cases around the state, you can see that every region of the state does have a great UFO history, from the Mallee to the Wimmera to the northeast to East Gippsland, where I am, to the metro area, to the Mornington Peninsula, to the Western districts. There really is, in the central goldfields area, there really is a great amount of cases that have actually occurred. And probably, you could talk about lots of sort of cases where people have been, chased by lights while they've been driving, or there's been a lot of strange effects with some landing impressions that have been made, and certainly going back to the 1950s and earlier, that certainly has been the case. But the modern UFO era in Victoria, sort of to try and summarise a little bit more, kind of really began in 1966, which was 2 years before I was born, in April 1966. And it sort of started on the 2nd of April, when a really strange object was photographed over the Melbourne suburb of Deepdene, or Baldwin, in that area of Melbourne. And the gentleman was outside his house, and he heard a strange noise, and he had a camera, and he pointed up, and he saw this silver object in the sky. I took a photo, and it made it into the papers at the time. And that kind of almost like was the event that sort of heralded the modern UFO era in Victoria. And the reason that sort of starts that, because it really was the start of a flap that occurred at that time. So that event occurred on the 4th of April 1966. A man was driving from Maryborough up to Witchyproof, and he had a very strange encounter at a place called Burke's Flat, where he was driving through there at night, and he saw this object off on the side of the road, and it divided into two halves with all these streams of light passing between it. And as his car approached it, the headlights were bent off the road and directly at this light display that was out in the paddock, and he nearly hit a tree. So that's the short version of that one. And then on the 6th of April, so it started on the 2nd of April with the Baldwin photo. The 4th of April, the mysterious Burke's Flat event occurred. And then on the 6th of April was when the Westall schoolyard encounter occurred at Westall out in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. So you had 3 key UFO events all occurred practically within a week of each other. Each of them dramatic UFO events in their own right. And then to add a bit more mystery to it, on the 7th of April at Burke's Flat, a young man named Gary Taylor was killed when his car hit a tree at the exact location where Ron Sullivan had seen his strange light display on the 4th. So around that time period, Joy, there was really a very active time for UFOs in Victoria. And that really probably is where the modern era of UFOs start and commences around those dates.
Wow.
So that's where it starts.
Yeah.
Then after that, there's, like you could go and cherry pick a whole lot of cases, but there are another couple that come to mind that are fairly good, are very well known cases. So on the 21st of October 1978, Fred Valentich was a pilot who disappeared in his light Cessna aircraft while mid-flight to King Island, and he reported a very close encounter with a unknown object, and both pilot and plane completely disappeared, and that made international headlines. It's probably almost been our biggest well-known case in the world, is the Fred Valentich disappearance, which occurred 12 years later than the Westall and the Burke's Flat cases. Then on the 30th of September 1980, there was another really strong case, and this case is a really good one, called the Rosedale UFO incident, where a water tank was drained of all its water by a UFO, and it left great physical traces of this event happening. The animals on the farm was terrified. The farmer was physically ill. It was a really good, strong case, and that was on the 30th of September 1980. So these are still cases that have occurred a long time ago, but they're very good cases. And then perhaps the last one to culminate the real famous cases was the Kelly Cahill encounter on the 8th of August 1993, when Kelly and her husband were driving home to Yallourn from Monbulk, and around midnight or so they encountered a large hovering UFO in the paddocks out in Narre Warren, and there was also more independent witnesses as well. So I can elaborate on any of these cases in greater detail, but that would be a snapshot of what I would consider to be the 4 or 5 really big cases that did make it into the international arena, and were investigated by people from overseas. Now, people from overseas took a great deal of interest in those cases. But around that, and since then, there has been many other UFO events that have occurred.
Yes, just those big cases. Why do you think they made it to the headlines and not the others?
Yeah, there's probably several reasons why. The events themselves are actually really quite dramatic. And you take Westall, for example. There's over 200 people or witnesses to that particular case. So that's a fairly big event, and it was incredibly hushed up at the time. So, and now it's in the last few years it's come out, and it's quite well documented now. So it really has had. So that was a case that sort of has bloomed much later than when it actually occurred. Whereas Fred Valentich was with a pilot disappearing with a plane. That's big news on any day, really. You know, so that's big news. Whether he, you know, that'll make the news every night. You know, when a plane falls out of the sky. So, but he didn't fall out of the sky, so that made that case quite big. And then the Kelly Cahill case, that had a lot of promise with all the different with the individuals who'd seen it. Very complex case. It made it into the news media. The news media latched onto it at the time, and it's probably around the time the X-Files was popular on TV. So I think that probably helped that case along as well. And the Rosedale case was perhaps not as well known. It was reported at the time in the local media, in the Sale Gippsland Times paper, and I think there was news footage taken from Melbourne as well at that time. So they really were probably cases that came out at the right time in each case, and they were probably at a time when the media really did seize onto those particular cases. But there's been many other cases equally as good as those cases that have gone nowhere near the media. And you can say that's down to things like the witnesses not wanting to, being reluctant to talk about their cases, not looking for publicity at all. A lot of UFO witnesses are very reluctant. You know, they aren't out there seeking to talk about these events that they've experienced. So there is that as well. So I definitely think these cases all were big enough to garner attention, and I think that they also perhaps occurred at the right time in their various time locations to get that sort of attention.
I see. And there was one with 2 police officers.
Yeah. Well, I was going to mention another.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's police. The police have been involved in UFO cases. They certainly have been, and there's 2 that come to mind for me, and one was 1972. And 1972 was another big UFO year. That was another big year in the UFO. You can say that 1966, 1972, and 1978 were perhaps some of the biggest years that we've seen UFO flaps occur in Victoria. We seem to have been there hasn't been occurring as much in recent times, and you know, maybe that's something we can look at as to why that might be the case. But yeah, the first one I'll talk about occurred in 1972, and it's such an amazing case, and it made it into it occurred in Sale, up where I am here in East Gippsland, and it was a policeman who was out doing his nightly patrols, and he was just out driving around, and there's a big RAF base at Sale as well, and that RAF base has been there since World War II. And this case occurred on the 20th of September 1972. And so it occurred at 4:40 a.m. So the policeman's out driving sort of north of Sale, and he's driving around out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, and he sees this object descend from the sky. It comes down and it lands on the ground, and then he sees it take off again. And he's a bit puzzled as to what it is. So he takes his patrol car and he drives to the Sale RAF base, which is just outside of Sale. And he talks to the RAF base, and he says to them, "Have you guys got anything out there tonight flying around in the skies?" This is at 4:40 a.m. in the morning, right?
Wow.
And yeah, and the RAF go, "No, we haven't got anyone out there." He says, "No, I definitely saw something out just north of Sale." So you know. So anyway, so one of the RAF intelligence officers hopped in the car with him, and they drove back out there. And they drive out there, and they're on the same road at a place called Napper's Corner or Napper's Bend, and there's nothing there. But they see in the distance from the east, this light starts travelling towards them, and the light's coming along the road, and the light is slowly travelling along, and all of a sudden it's on top of them, and it's hovering above the police car, and it shines a bright light down onto the police car, and the policeman and the RAF officer are standing outside the car looking up at this bright light from the sky. Then the object flies away. But this is the interesting part. The object flies away, but the light remains around the car. So the policeman and the RAF officer are standing there, and the light that the object had shone down is still illuminating the car after the object has disappeared. And this is a constable in East Gippsland in 1972. And there was other cases around that time as well. So that's one example of a police case where police officers do have UFO encounters. And there's an even more dramatic one than that, which occurred outside of Melbourne, out at Melton in 1983, when there was up to about 4 or 5 police cars chasing UFOs around the Western Highway, around Sydenham, around Melton and Rockbank. That was a very big UFO case. It did make it into the news at the time, and it was a Channel 7 report that was done about patrol cars and policemen and the inspector at the Melton police station all seeing these two particularly strange objects that were flying around in a kind of a triangular shape up in the sky over Melton in 1983. You can just imagine that today, can't you? 5 police cars out there chasing UFOs around in back then it was just paddocks, and Melton was nowhere near the big place that it is now, and as built up as it was much more rural back in 1983, and very dark and spooky out there at night. And there used to be an intelligence army listening station out there too at Rockbank, which had the big aerial antennas, and one of these objects approached the antennas and nearly flew into the antennas and then backed away and flew off again. And the police had no idea, and we actually got to speak to one of those policemen who was a constable at the time, and now he's a senior inspector in the police force. And Andrew and I went and we interviewed him one day about this particular encounter. And he just said that he didn't know what it was. He said he wants there to be a rational explanation for what they saw on that night as junior constables in the divisional van driving around the outer western suburbs of Melbourne. But they had no logical explanation for what they saw on that night. So, and I said to him, do police have any kind of protocol for dealing with UFOs? Do you guys have some sort of a system, or it's something that you have to, there's a procedures that you have to follow if a UFO is encountered? If a UFO landed on the Western Freeway, what would you actually do? And he said there are no protocols for the police to deal with flying saucers, UFOs, or anything of that nature. He said it's not actually under our charter of operations to look after that, and that makes sense to me. That would be the case. The police look after civil matters in the community to do with law and order. They're not really in charge of dealing with extraterrestrials or objects from other dimensions. And but that's the first people who are going to be called, and they're probably going to be the first ones to turn up if a flying saucer does land on the Western Highway to Ballarat. And what are they going to do? They don't have a protocol.
The military will probably come in.
That's correct. And maybe the military would appear. Maybe the military would appear. I mean, if you look at the Westall case and how quickly men in blue uniforms appeared at Westall out of the blue, then perhaps the military would be able to arrive. But who knows? It's an interesting scenario. What if a UFO does land on the M1? What if a UFO does land on the Calder Highway? What if
exactly?
And we're not equipped to cope with that. And in fact, in a COVID year, it's probably likely to happen.
Oh, that would be great.
That's my prediction.
Something else to focus on.
That would be great. That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, approximately how many sightings would be reported to Victoria UFO Action Group in a year? Approximately.
Oh, look, it's
about 200, or
yeah. Look, it varies. It varies, Joy.
Okay.
I mean, you can go through patches where, and it can even be months where you don't actually get anything reported, and that happens. And I can remember in the early days we were always worried about the fact that we weren't getting UFO reports. And next minute you'd get a whole flurry of them come in, and funnily enough, they were never for the same event.
Oh.
So that was always interesting. Yeah. So you get 5 or 6 UFO reports come in, but they're all totally unrelated. But one month you might see that. So look, I would say probably on average, you probably get about 80 reports, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in a year, 80 to 100 reports.
Mm.
Most of them are lights in the sky cases, and and they're interesting for the people who have those experiences. But it's very hard to investigate lights in the sky cases. All you can really do is just eliminate things like, it wasn't a Jetstar jet, it wasn't the International Space Station, it wasn't lightning, it wasn't birds. So it's really just an elimination process, but it doesn't leave you with anything at the end of that other than to say it's an unknown. It's either an unknown or a known, an identifiable known, or an unknown known that you can't identify. So that's the situation with lights in the sky cases, and that's the majority of the reports that any UFO group around the world receives. Is someone was standing on their back porch and they saw this object zigzag across the sky or did whatever it is. That's the majority of reports that actually do come in. But the ones that investigators are really looking for are the ones where there's a bit more meat to it than just lights in the sky. Like there was some type of interaction. There was a trace evidence. It burnt a tree. It burnt the ground. It left the flat grass on the ground. It sucked all the colour out of the grass. It terrified animals. That's split a tree open. This is the sort of stuff that UFO investigators really hope for, but they're incredibly rare events. They just don't occur as often as we would like them to.
Mm. And I think you made a good point that many people do not want to come out and report these things because of the fear of, being ridiculed, or they don't actually have enough evidence, but it's a very, very intense experience for them. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Did any of?
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah. In any of your cases that you know of, did any of them look like that? Look at that picture.
Yeah, that's a classic. That's a classic picture, and there are many reports of that very object that you've got behind you there, which looks amazing. There are many reports of that very thing. That's a very common report. I've got a report from Bryagalong that had an event that had a craft that looked very similar to that. So that you do see the classic metallic disc. And what I like to see is objects that are either consistent in description, like that object behind you, or I like to see objects that are completely unusual. Because I like to think that aliens and UFOs and interdimensional beings are going to be creating spacecraft and things like that are just way beyond anything that we would have the ability to comprehend, and stuff that should really blow our mind. When people talk about triangles in the sky and things like that, it's just not that far enough removed from what we can already produce ourselves. And I'm certainly not saying that they're not from somewhere else, but I prefer it when you get an object that's it's just not so different that you can't mistake it for being a US military aircraft, because it's just so different to what that would be.
Yes, so some of these could be man-made, but anyway, that's another subject.
Some could be, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's another subject. Yeah,
that's another subject.
And we don't have to go there.
Yeah. Have you seen any UFOs yourself, personally, that you'd like to share?
Yes. Yeah, I had an amazing encounter this year on the 15th of April. It was absolutely an incredible UFO encounter, and I have had other UFO encounters earlier in my life, but this one totally trumped anything I've seen previously. And I hadn't seen anything for a very, very long time, but it was a weeknight, and I think it was a Tuesday, and my sister rang me up, and she's lives about 15 minutes away from me, outside of town in a little rural area. And she rings me up and she says, "Ben, there's either UFOs or ghosts hovering above our house." Now, if my sister says that to you, you can take it to the bank that that's actually what it is, because she's the most down-to-earth person you'd ever meet. and she's not prone to flights of fancy at all in any way, shape or form, has no interest in UFOs, very straight down the line person, not at all interested in this sort of nonsense as she would think. So I said, well, describe to me what's happening. And she says, there's these clouds in the sky, and this is about 7 o'clock at night, dark, and they're flying around out over the back of our house, and they're moving around all over the place. It's really, really weird, and we don't know what it is. It's her and her husband are sitting out there. And I said, are they still there? Are they still there? And she said, yeah, they are. I said, I'm going to jump in the car, and I'm going to come over and stay on the phone and just talk to me. And if they disappear, just let me know. But I'm coming over to your place. So I'm on the phone, and she's about 15 minutes away. I got there in about 6 minutes. So I flew over to her house, and she said, when you come down the driveway, she said, turn your lights off, and I said, okay, I turn the driveway and come out the back. So I did that. And sure enough, off her back veranda, there is these objects in the sky, and they varied from as little as 2 or 3 to as many as probably about 12 to 15. And they are literally over her paddock, and they are darting back and forth, total silence. They would fly across, then they'd splinter into other objects. And so from one, you'd get another 3 would splinter out of one, and then they would dart back the other direction. They would hover, they would descend, they would just move back and forth. And we watched them. I watched it for an hour. And this went on for an hour. My brother-in-law watched it for an hour and a half from the very start. So for an hour, we sat on her back step, and we tried to video it. We tried to take photographs, but they were not illuminated. They were like clouds on a full moon night, in that you could see them quite clearly with your eyes. But when you tried to take a photograph of them, nothing would come up in the photos whatsoever. And I got audio I took at the time of us talking about it and looking at it, and it just kept going. They kept darting back and forth, stop, start, and they'd move from point A to point B, and it'd be so direct and so quick that you would see it go from point A to point B, but it was an immediate thing. It was from point A to point B. And it would be from point B to point C and down again. And then it might divide, and all these other ones would shoot off. And we kept watching it, and it got to about nearly an hour for me. And I said to my sister, when's this going to end? When's it going to end? And then all of a sudden, they all went into a straight line, like a straight line across the sky. They went really bright and dimmed, shrunk, and blinked out.
Wow.
So I don't know what that. Yeah, so I don't know what that was. I got no idea. It's not the space station. It's not a Virgin Jetstar jet flying to Auckland. It's none of those things. And it was really an incredible experience to have that. And that happened this year. And I did have the thought that there would be more UFO activity with the COVID shutdown, because all the planes aren't flying around out there. Maybe there would be more UFO encounters. But I certainly didn't expect to have such a great experience myself. With two other witnesses who just are not interested in this type of thing at all, and now interestingly enough, they're both firm believers.
I was going to ask that. After that, you can't not be a believer. That is amazing.
No, you
what
can't
a
not be a
show!
believer.
It's like over an hour.
It was a real show, yeah.
Did you do?
Yep.
Have you drawn it? Have you done a drawing of what they look like? And what did they look like?
Yeah, I've even taken some photos of them, of other clouds that look very similar to what we saw, and I've got photographs of them, and I'll describe them about as big as a house, right? Probably about as big as a house, or big as a house and a garage at least, right? At least that big. Like they were big, and I describe them as being like fuzzy around the outside. So they were not defined in a rigid kind of a way. Each one had a kind of a fuzziness around the outside, and that made me think, well, perhaps they're from another dimension, and perhaps they are literally just ghosting in and ghosting out of our dimension. And that's kind of the impression that I had as well, that these objects were here, but they were also not here at the same time. They were kind of ghosting in and sort of like, almost like when your TV screen does a bit of a flicker, when there's a signal interruption, like it was kind of almost a little bit like that. And we're going through all the logical explanations, like, torches on the sky and, insects and birds eating insects. And we're going through all that sort of stuff. And none of those explanations were standing up for it. So I have actually got some photographs because I've been looking ever since, like, what did it look like? What looked like it? What looked like it? And I've taken a couple of photographs of some really, some sort of clouds that kind of looked like what we were actually witnessing, but they were not clouds because they were moving at incredibly fast speed. They were going from there to there, and it was just pow. It was not wind. It was not some sort of a twister. It was nothing, no weather phenomenon whatsoever. It was really this kind of, I would almost describe it as being some type of a dimensional overlay of some sort. That's the only way I can describe what we saw. And this is no more than 100 meters in my sister's paddock, off her back veranda. And I got on Google Maps and I estimated that the distance they were traveling was probably about 600 meters, probably 600 to 800 meters. They were going back and forth across about a 600 to 800 meter thing, and they were crossing that distance in an instant. So there was no doubt about the speed, and the stopping power was just, it would just go from flat out to stop. And if there was people inside, they'd be splattered against the wall, like it was really, really high G-force maneuvering, all complete silence. Really just a mind-blowing experience to see something like it. And to see as many as 12 to 15 of them and as little as 2 or 3, they kind of like were sort of coming and going, and it was really, and they just ignored us. We're shining like a bright LED light on them, and talking, and we didn't have any sense of fear or anything like that. There was just pure curiosity about what we were looking at. There was nothing to be afraid of. But there were these things off the back there that were just moving so fast, but looking like nothing that we've seen before. Not looking like the disc behind you in your office there. Nothing like that. They were more like they didn't look like that at all. They were more of they definitely had more of an organic appearance in many ways. And I kind of had this other thought too, that maybe it was some kind of camouflage that they had on too. Like when you see the Predator movies, and the Predator puts his invisibility cloak on, and you can still sort of see where the Predator is, but he's got this invisibility cloak. It was almost like they were kind of cloaked in some way. Like it was really very bizarre.
So you said they look like clouds. Maybe the clouds were the cloaking, like the like a disguise, or do you think that
maybe
was the clouds that look like what, white fluffy ones or dark ones?
No. They were silver-like. They were like, if you look at a cloud on a full moon night, and you see those sort of whitey creamy coloured clouds that you see on a full moon night. That's what they look like, and they were below the clouds, the actual clouds that were there on that night. And there was clouds on that night. It wasn't a very windy night, but there were still clouds, and there was still some cumulonimbus clouds in the sky that you could see quite clearly. And then these objects were either below the clouds or in the clouds, and they were just moving around, but they kind of looked like clouds. So that was the really strange part about it, that they're moving in a very much a intelligently controlled, precise kind of a way. Not some on the wind phenomena, moving around in this very, very deliberate and precise manner. But they blended in with the surroundings. So you couldn't photograph it because it wasn't reflecting a light back at us. It wasn't some booming light on the bottom of a mothership. It was just it wasn't reflecting a light to us. It was, and in fact, I would have said if you're out on the road, say 300-400 meters back from my sister's house, and you were looking across, you wouldn't have seen them either. So if people have asked me, do you think anybody else saw them? And I go, no, because you just simply wouldn't have seen them. You had to be at that place at that time to have seen them. You wouldn't have seen them on the road. You wouldn't have seen them on the other side of the river. you had to have been in that place at that time to have seen these things. And they moved about with impunity, and they did what they wanted to do. They were not affected by us in any way, shape, or form. And we're out there on the veranda and making lots of noise and lights shining, and they didn't make any. It made no difference to them. And then they all get together in a straight line, in a complete straight line. You've got 12 of these objects all lined up in a perfect straight line. And then they all glow, they shrink, they go bright, and then they all blink out at once. So, you know, and once that happened, we knew it was over. Like show over. You know, it's not.
That's amazing.
Coming
so
back. That was because I said not.
It sounded like it was just for you guys.
It was almost
that
like
was just for you guys.
It was just for us. That was how the impression I had. Or maybe her neighbours potentially could have seen it, but there was no sign of life over at that house. And so, yeah, we were literally the ones who got to see it. I know that sounds really, really sort of like lame in some ways, but was literally the nature of that phenomenon. And this is the thing about UFO phenomena too, is that a lot of these things happen very quickly, even though my experience was for an hour. You know, like a lot of these things occur very. I've since had some cameras I've got now. I didn't have cameras then that were any good. Now I've got some really good cameras that I wish I had on that particular night. Might have actually caught something a little bit better than what we were able to do with iPhones, you know. So, you know, it was really
the problem with that this type of phenomena. It's very unusual. Usually, when you see something, you can't record it.
You're not
almost like they know.
Yeah, they know that you ain't got anything to record it with, or usually it happens too quickly, and you can't get your camera out anyway. I had another really strange encounter a few years ago, like probably 10 years prior to that, out at St Albans. This is just a quick little story about cameras. I was going to visit a friend at St Albans, and I was nearly at his house, and it's in the street, and I'm driving along, and I look up in the sky, and I see this metallic object, the same as what's behind your head there. I see a metallic disc in the sky, almost the same as that. Not quite the same, but that sort of general thing. And it's just sitting there. And it's an incredibly windy day out in St Albans. Like, you know, they've got a lot of wind out there. And this wind is howling. And this silver disc is just sitting in the sky. And then this Jetstar jet comes up and comes around the outside of it. And this Jetstar jet just flies very, very close by. And I thought, I've got to get my camera. And I searched my car from top to bottom, and I could not find my phone at all. It was like my phone had just completely disappeared. And I was just bloody devastated at the time, because this thing was sitting in the sky, and this is in the middle of the day, like probably 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's just sitting there in the sky, and I can't find my phone. I'm outside the car, I'm looking under the seats, I'm looking between the seats, I can't find my phone. And again, it's a classic case of not being ready to take a photo when phenomenon occurs.
Yeah, that happens too often. But just going back to that amazing sighting you had, 2 questions. What did you feel, and did you get any telepathic communications, do you think? Like any thoughts that really stood out when you were watching?
Well, we really, all 3 of us just felt, you know, this overwhelming sense of wonder and puzzlement. That was probably what our overwhelming, but also a real sense of euphoria as well. So, you know, we're wondering what we're looking at. We don't know what it is, but bloody hell, is it amazing. That was probably the 3 key emotions that we were feeling. And we're kind of like, you know, like almost, you know, rubbing each other's shoulders going, what is this? What is this? It's just it's an incredible thing to see. So we really had this feeling of euphoria. And I was on a high for days after having that experience. Like I was really on a high, and I really felt good for quite a few days after having that experience. And I've had numerous sort of strange things occur, but this was a real highlight. Like, it was really, really something that stood out. And my sister and I spoke about it several times after that in fairly quick succession about it. And we just would yeah, well, what did we see? What was that? And like, there's just a desire to continue talking about this this particular event, and and it was really amazing. And I suppose the only time I felt like there was some sort of, when I asked a question per se, was the question I asked was, when is this going to end, right? And when I asked that question, it almost brought it to conclusion, like, because we'd been sitting there just discussing, looking at, wow, this is amazing. What is it? Don't know what it is. Men with torches, bugs, birds, all this sort of stuff. We're going to, someone's got a projector and they're shining images on the sky. We went through all that stuff, and we conjectured all that. And then when I said, when's this going to end? It virtually wrapped up almost very soon after I put that mental question. And it was it was a mental question, and it was also a physical question. I actually did word those words, when is this going to end? And then they almost just like lined up, and then they just did this thing to like sign it off. So as far as a communication goes, that was either an incredibly intuitive coincidence that I was thinking this thing's going to end, right? Or they went, this is going to end. And whether I had any impact on that, I don't know. But it was tied very closely to me raising that question, and then the final light show and the disappearing. And the brightest they were was in the last couple of seconds before they all disappeared, and they were almost as bright as starlight by the time, or by Jupiter or Venus. Probably you could call Jupiter Venus. They were as bright as those planets in the sky when they shrunk down and just disappeared. So that was the kind of thing where I thought, we've been watching this for an hour. Is it going to go for another hour, another 2 hours? Like, what's going to happen, or is it going to end? And then it just ended. Like, as soon as I raised that question, it disappeared. So maybe that was some type of
communication. Just when you thought it or asked that question, it ended. Like it lined up and ended.
What is this? And I suppose the associate question to that was, the associate question to that is, how is this going to end?
Oh.
When is it going to end, and how is this going to end? And it kind of didn't surprise me in how it ended. Like, it just ended in a way that seemed like pure poetry perfection for how that experience should end. Like they all went into a straight line. They all grew bright. They all dimmed. They all grew, and then they all blinked out simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Not one up. They all went out simultaneously.
So your sister and her husband's life, I would imagine, has changed. Like, it would
on some levels, yes.
The cognitive dissonance and a total questioning or re-questioning of what reality is.
Yes.
And, but what about you?
Yes.
Was there
that's not a big leap for me.
It wasn't a big leap for you. Did anything strange happen after that?
No.
Okay. So maybe you were there.
Nothing strange.
You were there to guide them. Like, I don't know. I mean, it's a huge change for them, but because you were there, and you had the background, you could guide them.
Do that to a certain extent, because they're both really lay people in that they don't follow anything like this at all. Not interested in any level. And when they're saying something like that, it is a big leap for them, but it's only a small leap for me, because I, talk about UFOs, investigate UFOs, totally open to anything happening. Nothing would surprise me, really. But, for people who don't think about it, I think that was probably quite a good statement that you made, that me being there I was able to kind of, help them go through that process, and to say that they saw it with someone else. It wasn't just husband and wife seeing it. She saw it with me, even though I'm still family, I'm still independent of them. And it was, I probably did help them to process that experience.
Wow. Now, I want to move on to another subject, but before we do that, you did mention there's a whole lot of other Melbourne, Victoria cases, and there are some maybe unknown Victoria cases. And you are going to give a talk on the 22nd of August.
Yes.
On Saturday, 8 o'clock. And so you're going to give a talk about those more unknown Victoria local cases. That'd be really fascinating.
Yes.
And then we'll open it up for Q&A. It's a free event, and I will put the link below. So vufoa.net. But I will put the link below. You have to register on Eventbrite, even though it's free. But to get the link, you need to register.